Okay, I think we're gonna start. We're 11 minutes past, so I think we're good to go. And then whoever joins will join. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here for the term Second on Empathy. Tonight's event is about identity, so I don't want to miss the chance to tell you all happy Pride, happy Indigenous History Month, and happy belated Juneteenth by 7 days. Before we start, I want to encourage those who feel comfortable to turn on their cameras and show their faces so that hopefully we can all feel like we're in the same room together. But I will also add that we're recording this for those who can't be here, so keep that in mind if it causes any discomfort for you. I'm Penise Mayeri. If you don't know me, I'll be the moderator tonight. Here with me are a few of my really good friends. Hanin Dalla Ali, you can wave as I tell your people your names. Hanin Dalla Ali, Jessica Henzel-Kova, and Danielle Rosen. I've had the privilege of seeing these three work on their research, and I've been at awe of their brilliance and honored to be in their company, especially in masters. This was done with closer proximity to Hanin and Danielle since we did our undergrad together. And then went into masters at the same time as well. We finished our undergrad in 2015, all took a year off and came back in 2016 for our masters. But we defended at scattered times. So Danielle was the fastest one. She defended in September 2018. I was second. I defended in January 2019, and Hanin defended in May 2019, right? Yeah. But Jessa's story is slightly different. She did her undergrad at Laurentian. And she came to Waterloo in 2017 to do her master's, where we met. Actually, we met before that because she was the RA for our brilliant Tammy Gaber, who's present here tonight. So we'd met before, but officially
Tammy, wave.
became friends when she came to Waterloo in 2017. And she just defended her master's in May with flying colors, so congratulations are in order. Tonight's event is a chance to explore some of the themes that are common across the three theses. And so they all explore identity, what it means, and how it can be expressed through creation and making. But the interesting thing is that all three theses do this in incredibly different ways, even though some of the methodologies that are being used are consistent across them. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting points of departure for discussion tonight and for reflection. So I'm very excited for that. We'll be talking a bit about space and identity and how they're framed within each work. But we also all want to talk about the act of working on an identity-driven research, the struggles it has, the rewards that can come with this kind of material, to hopefully act as a bit of an inspiration for people going through the process right now or might be in 4B thinking about starting masters soon. And so we really want to be able to create a larger discussion with everybody kind of joining in. So feel free to raise your hands or type in the chat with your questions at any point. So the format will be that Hanin, Jess, and Danielle will each talk between 5 to 7 minutes, maybe a little bit longer for Hanin.
Yeah, mine might run. I'll try to keep it short.
They'll talk a bit about their work, and then I will act as a bit of a moderator, asking some of the questions as kind of prompts to open discussion. And yeah, during that time, feel free to add your questions in the chat and kind of raise your hands. I'll do my best between my ADHD tendencies to catch everything you say. So, and yeah, and then afterwards, it'll definitely be an open floor for conversation. And I think with all of that housekeeping, I'll hand it off to Hanin.
All right, awesome. Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen here. Hopefully it won't flicker when I'm sharing. Can everybody see it? Mm-hmm. All right, so my thesis was entitled Tracings, Unraveling Home in the Diaspora. And throughout my thesis, I was looking at these two questions in the beginning. And the first one being, how does displacement affect the identity of the individual? And how can the displaced individual's layered notion of home be discerned through making? So these are the 5 lenses that I was kind of trying to answer those questions through. And they also happen to be the titles of my 5 chapters in my book. So the first one is of memory, of experiment, of sensation, of encounter. And the last one is Tracings, Unraveling Home and Diaspora, which is about the 4-part textile series of installations that I created. So throughout the thesis, I reflect on what home means to me and where home is today. So the first part of memory, I'm just gonna, for the sake of time, just kind of skim through this part because I want to focus more on the making aspect of for the sake of the discussion. So in the beginning, I was kind of lost and, trying to think about my identity and home. I kind of decided to go back to my childhood and kind of start by looking at my first home, or one of the first homes that I've kind of inhabited. And it's my maternal grandparents' house in El Khaldamia, Baghdad. And I was kind of starting to reflect on memories that I've had in that house. And interestingly enough, the most vivid memories that I've had were of spaces that were neither indoor nor outdoor. I mean, they were kind of outside, but they were still private and closed and felt very kind of intimate. So I was kind of pretty intrigued by that concept. So this is the driveway that you can see here. One of those spaces that I played in as a kid. And I was kind of curious about where this kind of, in modern day Iraq, where this embrace of the indoor-outdoor lifestyle came from. And so I decided to go back one generation and look at the traditional courtyard houses of Baghdad, specifically in the same neighborhood where my grandparents' house was, which is Al Khaldamia, which is a historical city that kind of is built around this shrine, Al Khaldamia shrine. And interestingly enough, actually in this photo, you can see that I'm guessing this is where my great-grandparents' house was, but it's torn down, but this is the location where I'm guessing it was. So it was right in front of the shrine, and my mom has some memories of playing in that house as a child. So I started to look at this topology just to answer that question of, why the fascination and with the indoor-outdoor lifestyle. So obviously, just by looking at the houses, you can see that the house kind of features an interior courtyard that the whole house kind of unfolds around. You can see that in this photo as well. And so it kind of made sense why the daily rituals some of them were taking place outside within the privacy of the home. So this is one of the most fascinating rituals for me that I found interesting through stories that my parents told, which is in the summer when the weather gets really hot, people take foldable beds and they go upstairs to the roof of the house and they spend the night up there because it's cooler and there's a night breeze up there. So, I was really fascinated by this ritual, and this is a section of the courtyard house showing how open the house is. So this is the courtyard inside the house. So kind of listening to my parents' stories about sleeping on the roof, I started to kind of reflect on some of the daily rituals that I remember as a kid. And one of them being that's a massing model of a traditional courtyard house. And that's my grandparents' house in Al Khaldamia, just to compare the spaces and how big they are. So the ritual that I remember the most was the ritual of washing the carpets at the end of the spring in preparation for summer. And so what would happen is in the winter, like we used to have carpets kind of to keep it warm under your feet. And then in the summertime, they're rolled, washed and stored away to expose the cool tile under. So you can see the comparison of the same floor in my grandparents' house with and without the carpet. And that kind of ritual really inspired me and gave me some ideas for my installation, because when the carpets were being rolled and taken upstairs to the roof to be washed, it felt like the whole room was kind of being displaced and kind of taken upstairs because it was such a big part of the room. And so just watching that ritual, I kind of was starting to see how the carpets kind of play this role of it gives like an impression of indoor-outdoor just because they depict gardens as well. So these are carpets that my family folded and brought with us to Canada from the Middle East. So we used them in the Middle East and we still use them today. And these are stills from a video that I took of me folding up the carpet to see how small I can fold it to be, just to remember how it kind of fit in our luggage. So this is one of them being folded. They get pretty small, so it makes sense why they're so portable, because they're flexible. This carpet is interesting to me because it was used in my great-grandparents' house in one of the courtyard houses. And then it was later used in my mom's childhood home, the one that I showed earlier, and now they are kind of used by us here in Canada. So it kind of traveled through countries, time, and was used by different generations, which I thought was really cool. So after kind of looking at carpets, I started to kind of be interested by this notion of a portable almost space or parcel of the space. So in the next chapter of experiment, I was starting to look at, I was first of all starting to experiment with materials, and I was starting to look at works of other artists who in their work tackle similar issues to what I was trying to tackle, which is issues of displacement and sorry, I can't see you guys, so I don't know if I'm still in the call. Am I in the call? Hello? Good? Okay.
You're perfect. Yeah, sorry. We just
because I like it's dead silence, so I just freaked out for Okay, cool.
Keep going.
Here again. Gonna keep going. All right, so I'm just gonna skim through this this section. You can see some of the works by some of the artists that I was looking at. So this is Cal Lane. She kind of mixes these really intricate lacy patterns with industrial items to kind of juxtapose things that are stereotypically masculine, feminine, soft, and hard, and it's kind of her commentary on those topics. And so I was, at this point, I was kind of taking other artists' methods and kind of trying to apply them to my own work and experiment with them. So, and that was a way for me to kind of step away from my own, like kind of look at my identity objectively through somebody else's lens. So I kind of responded to these artists' works that I was looking at through my own objects. So if you guys remember, the Timbits box was one of them. Another artist I was looking at was Brian Union. And the object that I created in response to that was the goalie mask, also transfigured by Islamic geometry. Another artist I was looking at, especially when I was kind of considering creating something that was portable and foldable, was Doho Soo. And in this piece, he kind of creates a fabric replica of his home in, I believe, Korea, and he kind of nests it inside of his home in Providence, USA, as a commentary on displacement. In this project, he covers an apartment that he lived at one point in his life in New York in paper, and he starts to kind of reveal the texture by using pencils and crayons to kind of reconnect with the space and reflect on his own memories in that space in the process. And it was kind of, I thought it was fascinating that he had this kind of private performance. And so I kind of wanted to try that process, but a little differently. So I took a piece of fabric and I dipped it in fabric stiffening solution, and I placed it on a rock just outside my house here in Mississauga. And I was rubbing it as well, just like he was. And then I let it dry, and then I peeled it away, and it retained the form and the texture of the rock, which I thought was really fascinating. Another artist was Chiharu Shiota. She kind of creates these very theatrical, almost like sprawling webs inside of spaces to kind of convey certain emotions. And her work was very powerful. It definitely inspired me a lot. So in response to that, I kind of went back to the mold that I created, and I placed saran wrap on top of it and started to create using, I believe this was, what was this? Oh, crochet string at this point on top of the mold, and spraying it with fabric stiffener to create these kind of almost like, they look like ghosted rocks. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to create something that was a textile because it was portable. So this experiment was interesting, but it didn't, the string was so bulky that it didn't capture enough of the texture for me. So I scaled down to thread, which was actually awesome because it had more variety in terms of colors and finishes. So this was probably the last experiment that I did before I started creating my final pieces, which I was really excited about. So the next chapter is of sensation, and I basically go back to my first home in Mississauga, which is this apartment building, and the landscape that surrounds it. And it was interesting because I kind of spent the first 4 years of my life looking at the landscape from my 9th floor living room window. And for some reason, like, I don't know if it was because I had just come like from the Middle East where the outdoors are kind of seen as threatening in one way or another. I mean, I lived in UAE, and like the temperature alone could kill you if you're outside for too long. So I was very threatened by the site, and I never explored it physically, if you can believe that, for 4 years. So for my thesis, I wanted to kind of confront that that landscape, and I went back and started photographing it, trying to think of ideas of what I can do to connect with it. And so this is the site during the summer. And another way for me to connect with it was through sketching. So this is a panorama of one of the locations throughout the site. I was kind of experimenting with colors at this point as well. And interestingly enough, these sketches were starting to resemble the thread samples that I created earlier. So I decided to focus on 3 locations in the site where the rock formations were interesting for me. And so this is the first location. This is the only one that was visible from my apartment. So I started there, and I wanted to carry out this exact same method, but I wanted to do it on a larger scale. So I went back to the site, and using, I believe they were probably like 1.5 meters by 2 meters big pieces of fabric, dipped in fabric stiffening solution and placed them on the rocks, and try to capture some sort of a mold to kind of work with at home. So these are stills from a video of me doing that, placing the fabric on the rock. And this is, I believe, me brushing some more fabric stiffening solution on it. And unfortunately, this didn't work because it was at the end of the summer and the temperatures weren't hot enough to allow the pieces to dry fully. So at this point, I had this, well, it was kind of like a panic moment, but also a big shift in my method, where I was like, well, I should maybe approach this from a digital point, since the weather is probably not going to help me much at this point. So I kind of came across this method called photogrammetry. And basically what you do is you take photos of whatever object you're trying to scan, and then you use the software to put it together into a 3D model. So I was like, worst comes to worst, I can just have digital installations instead of physical installations. So I used a piece of paper to be able to scale them back in Rhino. And basically it builds them in layers in the program and uses the images, the photos that I took to kind of add the texture and the colors. They were surprisingly really high quality. So these are the 8 models that I created. And then I decided to focus on one, and I projected lines on, like a grid, a linear grid on it, to kind of extract the profiles of the rock. And then I put together this cardboard waffle structure model to kind of start to create some sort of a skeleton for the mold that I was trying to create. So this is what it looked like. It was kind of like, it was really fun. It was kind of like a giant puzzle in my house. So that's it assembled on the right. So inspired by Vanessa Dean Fletcher's project Writing Landscape, where she takes copper foil sheets and she wears them as sandals and walks across landscapes that are kind of like part of her heritage as an Indigenous Canadian artist. And I believe they were around Lake Superior. And just the weight of her body kind of allows the texture of the land to be embossed in the copper, and was later displayed. So inspired by that, I was kind of trying to create a skin for the mold at this point. So I kind of did the same process. At this point, it was in the middle of winter, so it was a little bit challenging, but luckily the copper is really durable and allowed me to do that. So just close-ups of the mold. So I basically, after taking the mold, I took it back home in this kind of format. They're just like long sheets of copper, and placed it on top of the skeleton that I created. And I had my mold at that point. So the next chapter is of encounter. And at this point, I was going back to earlier ideas that I had in my thesis of juxtaposition. And I wanted to combine my childhood memories of watching the carpets being washed with, and memories of my house in general, with the landscape, the Canadian landscape that I lived around for 4 years. And I was kind of striving to create, as Deleuze says, an object of encounter rather than an object of recognition. And basically an object of encounter is an object that kind of changes the way that you look at a concept or a thing rather than just represents it. So that was my ambition for that part of the thesis. So this is a time lapse of the of me creating one of the pieces. So it was layers and layers and layers of thread, and kind of spraying it with fabric stiffening solution after each layer. I think this was the spring piece. So these are my final pieces, I guess, that I created. So this is the site during the summer. So basically the 4 pieces that I created each represent, or not represent, but they kind of showcase the colors of the site during each different season. And I chose to work with the idea of seasons because I like the idea of how seasons mark the passing of time visually for us, and me watching the site from above kind of change colors over the seasons over the 4 years of my life. In Canada, in the beginning, post-migration was really interesting. So, and also kind of experimenting with those colors through the sketches. And this is the final piece. This is the summer one. Summer 2018, I believe. Close-ups of it. And I kind of did this for each season because I ended up spending time at the site in each season, which was really fascinating and interesting. So this is the fall piece. Winter season. It was really fascinating to me how the site changes over time. I guess this was my first time seeing different, like the 4 seasons being shown so distinctly in a place, because I lived in UAE and Iraq before that, and the trees don't really change colors over the seasons. So it was always fascinating to watch the changes. So winter piece, and the last piece, which is the spring piece. These are the pieces at Remembering What Is to Come, the Masterworks exhibition last fall. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Haneen.
Hope I didn't go over too much.
It's all good, but for the sake of time, I think we're gonna move on to the next person, and then we'll have the discussion after that. So, Jess, I think you're next.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so hi, for those of you that don't know me, and as Penny's mentioned, my name is Jessica, and my thesis is entitled The Artifacts of No Place. So I'm going to spend the first half of my presentation reading the prologue of my thesis because I feel that it situates my take on the topics of identity, identification, and design most clearly. After reading this passage that you see in front of you, I will quickly try to summarize some of the themes in design work that I pursued in my research. So this is the prologue. 2018, I dreaded the prospect of the thesis. Coming out of an undergraduate education which prioritized phenomenology and critical regionalism, I wondered if I would have to make some building which would be emblematic of my cultural identity to be relevant. Is this all that I could or should offer to architectural discourse as a person minoritized from the lens of the Western architectural canon? The prospect made me roll my eyes so hard I feared they would get stuck. But then I had an even worse thought. What would I design? As a child of immigrant parents that fled communism and war from 2 different countries back in the 80s, I had no country of origin to miss, much to the disappointment, I'm sure, of all the people that yelled at me from car windows to tell me to go back to where I came from. The places these people imagined were places that were never home, never places that I could relate to. What I knew best were the siding-clad towns of southern Ontario, but a thesis on suburbia, specifically because of its history in privileging certain races, classes, and genders, was equally as disheartening. So what could I design? I briefly considered a typological study of cultural centers, broad stroke, but this quickly turned to fear as I realized that I might end up designing an ambiguous cultural center to unify all the othered groups of society. The prospect of designing a library, which could be considered a more apolitical public space, felt marginally better. I liked books, I liked libraries. Both these theses were noble ideas, yet still I wondered if my thesis would then only revolve around trying to subtly integrate sandblasted motifs onto curtain walls to make glass more culturally specific, or how best to design a door handle that formally hinted at the historic textile industry of the site. Further, what gave me the authority to design either? So instead I asked what was home to me. I found the answer in a mirror. The mirror I found was in situating my explorations on myself. Quite literally, I became the site for my thesis as I created a series of masks, which I called the artifacts of no place, to digest the research I was doing. The masks allowed me to take very abstract philosophical ideas I was becoming acquainted with in the fields of critical theory, feminism, critical race theory, and posthumanism, and channel them into a simultaneous process of making. This process of making involved 8 prototypes. The prototypes were always white masks made using laser cutting or 3D printing methods, and included microcontrollers and a circuit which modulated light inside of the masks. The pulse sensor, which was attached to the circuit, attached to the wearer's ear that would detect the person's heartbeat and then flash a red light on the inside or attached to the side of the mask. And it would flash in time with the rhythm of their heartbeat. I use this as a way to animate the masks and make the internal external and connect the wearer to their body in a more intimate and visual way. This process of making, using digital fabrication and heartbeats to make the masks, fed into a practice of performance art. Each mask that I made lent itself to different performances, different means of liberation, concealment, and spectacle. Whether in obliterating the face and affording the anonymity, or celebrating difference and bringing a group of people together in an intimate space, the masks explored the boundaries of the body and bodies as a way of grappling with the notion of identity and belonging. For the first 4 prototypes, I took the masks out into public space and played with identification. I donned the masks and disrupted different public spaces using my body and movement. I found this practice to be super empowering as I took up space and lingered in these transitory spaces. All of these different paradigms and methods folded into how I communicated my own experiences within the context of my thesis and in my life. In my thesis book, I toggle between short personal analogies, really heavy essay sections, which examined philosophical questions about dualism, such as subject and other and us versus them, and also interrogate the ideas of identity and belonging. But also I use these kind of written components of my thesis to also examine kind of the cusp that I was beginning to explore in my research, which was a shift in ideology from being to becoming, and understanding things as not static, but as a process. And this was also accompanied by visual narratives where I document the prototypes with a curated series of images, some of which you saw in this presentation. And so these different lenses allowed me to confront labels of identification that have been overlaid on me as a woman, a digital native, and a perceived other, lenses which I used in a critical and playful way in my explorations of making and performance art. Having grown up in Cambridge and bouncing around only mid-sized Ontario cities during my life, I've encountered these labels as a demarcation of otherness, either through a racialized or gendered lens. The other as an outsider is identified in exercises of power over, in delineations of a boundary between, and distinguishing an us and a them. These fictions, once established and once necessitated by a society, pervasively cycle and feed off of one another. It is thus that the liar believes in his lies by dint of repeating them. Racialized people or diasporic groups are often given the advice of returning to one's roots as a means of contending with the boundaries drawn in our society. Yet while this is often liberating for a great many of us to do, it does not fully quench the inequalities produced within normative North American society, particularly when fitting in is unattainable in the lived experience of one's body, or when access to one's roots is a distant thing. These are ideas that maybe we can expand more on in the conversation. And so I just wanted to finish my presentation by sharing this quote that I found kind of super helpful as I was navigating my thesis. And it's by an artist named Emma Portner. she's a dancer and a choreographer. And so she states, bound by a hypermasculine culture, women have been traditionally kept from taking up space. Historically, male artists have been mostly responsible for how women are seen. That is, as objects that have been shaped to personify a man's perspective. Consequently, female artists spend much of their already compromised room for work merely refuting false representations. My own experience, and this is Emma's partner's experience, has been informed by a society contained by aggressive men, and trauma came easily as a byproduct of just existing at all. And I guess I wanted to share that because it kind of encapsulated kind of what I was always grappling with during my thesis is how much do you repeat certain talking points or certain arguments to be either treated with the same humanity or that your perspective mattered in certain academic settings or that kind of stuff. When in the end, like kind of just by constantly refuting this, you get caught in kind of this like you're kind of just talking and reacting and talking and reacting, and then nothing ends up getting done. And so then in my thesis, I was trying to really like explore kind of the labels that I felt bound by in my own kind of life through art, using kind of this framework that Emma Portner also uses in her work. That wasn't a very cohesive ending, but yeah, just to summarize things, that's it. Stop sharing.
That was a great ending. Okay. Thanks, Jess. Danielle, want to jump in and start your presentation? And yes, we're clapping for you. We'll do like a collective clap at the end. Yeah.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, one sec. Okay, hi. My name is Danielle Rosen. My thesis was called Still Wandering, Tales from the Diaspora. So when I started my thesis in 2016, I had a completely different concept. It was going to be about contemporary craft. And I had this idea of following 4 master craftspeople and kind of learning from them and learning about how they got to where they were and traveling a lot. But in our first semester of masters, we were assigned a project of creating a curiosity cabinet, which was dedicated to both our experiences and our ambitions of our thesis. So I decided that because I was looking into craft, it was a good opportunity to craft a wooden box. And in considering my experiences and the ambitions of my thesis, included in my box were a collection of postcards, trinkets that were given to me by friends and family, and ultimately a transcription of a variety of family stories that had been kind of secretive for many, many years. I ultimately ended up laser etching an image of my father's family on the lid, as you can see here. At the time, I couldn't explain this pull to tell these stories and include imagery of my family and moving forward with my thesis, other than that these were stories that I just felt deserved to be told simply because they were good stories. So 6 months into my thesis, in the middle of my second semester, I completely changed my topic and began to trace these stories throughout my family history. These stories took me to archives, museums, haunted houses, synagogues, all throughout Ontario, Quebec, and rural New York. I visited buildings that my family had occupied and wrote about how those places have since changed since they occupied them and how they changed my family in turn. Through archival documents, pieces of family history that have been passed down, and my own recollections, I aim to illuminate a group of people who otherwise risked being lost to the passing of time. And for a long time, I struggled to find a tether between these places and the unfolding stories. And in terms of the idea of identity in the larger scale of this talk, how to take ownership within that identity. So out of which these struggles came a sukkah. So a sukkah is an annually constructed temporary space that is dwelled in for 8 days during the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. In order for the sukkah to be considered kosher, it must follow a whole variety of technical rules. And sukkas are usually talked about in terms of these laws pertaining to kind of very boring things like dimensions and materiality. There's really no guideline for the actual design of them. These laws, as well as the temporary nature of the sukkah, allow for the sukkah to be somewhat of a neglected architectural object. The holiday of Sukkot, when the sukkahs are built, it's a multifaceted holiday. It celebrates both the abundance of the fall harvest as well as commemorates the temporary dwellings that the Jewish people created after their exodus from Egypt when they wandered for 40 years in the desert. This dual significance of the agriculture and the biblical bring up a variety of opposing ideas: rootlessness versus rootedness, wandering versus return, exposure versus shelter. So I first considered constructing a sukkah for my thesis after reading an essay by Miriam Lippis, in which she describes how a sukkah becomes a placemaking tool that is situated in the tension between diaspora and belonging. The act of building and dwelling within a sukkah creates a symbolic, physical reconstruction, allowing one to be connected to a long line of ancestral sukkahs, while creating a personal experience through the event and the conversations that occur within it. In the fall of 2017, I opened up my sukkah to friends, family, and the Waterloo school community. Each of the 8 nights took on a different character based on who occupied the space. In this image here, sitting beside me on the left is actually the rabbi from the Chabad Waterloo synagogue who joined us to eat and answered a lot of questions. Actually, there's Haneen. She came that night too. Answered a lot of questions just that anyone had, really about anything. And each night we had an overall theme based on a symbolic biblical guest who embodied an attribute that makes up the universe based on Kabbalist teachings. Thus, we had the nights of love, strength, truth, eternity, humility, connection, and receptiveness, in which we discussed these concepts and connected over our shared stories. My thesis allowed me to analyze my world at different scales, from the religion and culture I was born into to a larger geographical leap from Eastern Europe to North America of my ancestors, to my own personal family history, and finally to understanding myself and my own sense of place and how I fit into that narrative.
Beautiful, thank you. I think we can have our collective clap here. Okay. Hannah knows how to use the emojis. Okay. So thank you all for your lovely presentations. I think I'm going to start by posing questions, and then if anyone has questions to jump in, feel free to do that, either by writing in the chat or raising your hands virtually on Zoom. We'll figure it out. Okay. So the 3 sets of questions I have kind of cover the content and identity as the subject matter, the process and methods of making, and then finally kind of the larger picture of so what. So starting with the content, I think it's kind of very evident that like you all have theses that Robert John would call backyard theses. They're very close. You're kind of dealing with your own personal histories and your family's history. And the way that you go about doing this in many ways reflects what was available to you at the time and what you had access to. Haneen, you explored personal memories of what you could remember from your childhood in Baghdad. Danielle, you delved into archives, interviewed family members, you physically went to places. And you even went as far as taking a DNA test and like looking on ancestry.ca to find different connections. Jess, you didn't have the kind of maybe connections that Haneen and Danielle had to like a background or like a culture in the same way, but you very much delved into theory to explore identity. So I want you to each to kind of talk about these different methods of approaching identity, the pros and cons of each, kind of looking at memory versus theory versus kind of like concrete archival journalistic approach to it, and kind of talk about why you ended up with each methodology, the pros and cons of each, the struggles with it, and if you would do anything differently today, if you have any advice for people doing this kind of work. So feel free to comment. Go.
Honey, do you want
Okay, I'm thinking as I'm talking. It's really hard when you're doing a thesis about identity to kind of think of a method that works perfectly to kind of answer those questions for you that you have about your identity, because you're you, like you can't look at it from the outside as much. So for me, I mean, I think with my hands, so making for me was actually something really obvious to do, whether it's sketching or experimenting with materials or whatever. It just was kind of my way of exploring those questions. But I'd say that using art, like I was looking at a lot of precedents that were contemporary artists who were, like I showed in my presentation, were, you know, people of color, women, people who generally felt like they didn't belong in certain spaces. And I kind of was analyzing how they were going about answering those questions about identity and exploring them, and themes like displacement and belonging. And it actually helped a lot. So for me, that was my starting point, was like watching somebody else do it and kind of borrowing their method in a sense, and then applying my story to it after. So for me, that's kind of where I started with those experiments. Yeah.
Anything you would change?
What's that?
Anything you would change if you were to do it again?
Oh yeah, oh definitely a lot of stuff would change. It's funny because like it unfolded in a very non-linear way. So now, like looking at it in hindsight, like obviously I would know what to do at this point. But I mean, identities are always changing, though. They're not fixed. So I guess if I were to go back and start with my identity right now, it would be kind of different. So maybe I wouldn't know exactly what to do differently, but you know, certain things for sure. Like I wouldn't do that experiment at the end of summer when it's getting cold. Like I would do it kind of when the temperature is, that would have saved me months of work. Things like that. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
For me, yeah, I mean, definitely approaching it, you know, coming from a place that was privileged. I mean, the ancestors and the family members that I was writing about and learning about had all immigrated here. So I was able to talk to people here who knew them, or visit places that they had been. I get more into this in my actual thesis, but my great uncle Aaron was mayor of small town Ontario. And so fortunately, he was documented in archives, and his life was well recounted. So going about it kind of more journalistic, as Penny's put it, kind of trying to uncover things as I learn them. I really definitely less than Jessica and Haneen. I didn't approach theory in the same way that they did. I kind of pushed that aside in favor of just kind of exploring the depths of what I could within my family, and understanding who they were purely from stories, what I was told or what I remember, what I knew. In terms of what I do differently, such a hard question.
It is, yeah.
Also, like Hennian said, like, you know, looking at my thesis now, it's all laid out in proper order, but, you know, it wasn't like that while it was happening. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of dead ends that I encountered, and a lot of lost time. Personally, for me, I wish that I had involved certain family members less than I did. I mean, what I would change is so particular to my thesis. I'm not sure how much it can speak to methodology. Just other than that, I was fortunate to have done what I was able to do.
Jess?
So I guess I'll chime in. So when I started my thesis, I felt super baseless. I felt that I didn't even quite understand what belonging was. And so I kind of started from ground zero. I was like, what is identity anyways? Like, what is culture anyways? And like, if I'm trying to claim a cultural identity, what do these words even mean, especially in my own experience? And so I guess like what you could almost, what I was trying to hint at in my presentation is that I did feel a little bit placeless as I entered the thesis. And I think that comes from, and I'm sure like this is a shared experience for many people, is that for myself at least, so my family isn't religious. And so growing up in suburban Cambridge and having parents that weren't deeply like immigrated when they were children, weren't deeply connected to their roots, there's actually sort of a loss of culture. I'm monolingual, I can only speak English. And so in terms of trying to come to terms with my own identity and belonging, there were certain paths that felt like there were barriers to getting over them. And so I really love Haneen and Danielle's theses because they very kind of bravely barrel right through those barriers and try to pull back some of those memories that for myself I'm less connected to. And that's also partially because so a lot of what you'll find in my thesis is me trying to grapple with a sort of a racialized and gendered identity that I'm still pushing back against. It's like, can I declare this? A lot of my experiences, so I'm mixed Chinese, Vietnamese, and Czech. And so a lot of my experiences of either of these two cultures has been one of gatekeeping, where I'm not quite enough to fit in there. I don't fit into regular society. And so it raises a lot of questions about kind of, from my own standpoint, what identity was to begin with, because I didn't have one that I could be like, oh, if I go down this path, I will definitely feel more comfortable with where I am in society. And then I guess if I were to change something, it's actually funny because Derek, who's my supervisor, was always asking me to try to make it more personal, to tell more stories that were related to my experience, but I always held all of my kind of analogies are at arm's reach. Like I'm speaking about my experiences through an abstract lens. I'm using abstract kind of symbols. They're not directly related to either culture necessarily that I come from. And that's always because I was always grappling with the idea, like how much do I need to perform my own pain or difficulty in life to qualify, for my experience to qualify as evidence of my humanity, I think was the question that I was always asking myself. It's like how vulnerable, how much do I need to expose my own kind of experience for it to be enough to justify it being worthy of an academic study. And so I think that that was just kind of my take on it. And that's why it kind of resulted in a more theoretical approach, I think. I felt disconnected, wasn't sure where to even begin and which route to take, and then went wholeheartedly into more theoretical undertaking. Yeah.
And I think that a sense of belonging is definitely a theme that you all bring up, being between the two worlds and even more than two worlds, right? And how you each go about relating to that, which kind of makes me think about the idea of belonging to a diaspora. Because Haneen and Danielle, you explicitly talk about diaspora is in the title of your thesis. You're talking about the experience of being diasporic, and but it's still different between the two of you, because for Haneen there's a homeland, there's a very definite place, she was born there, she remembers it, but Jess, you, as you said, you are tired of being told to identify with diaspora almost. You question the concept of a identity, and you talk about it being something that is put on people. So I kind of want to, if you can talk about this idea of displacement, this idea of belonging. And sorry, I'm just going through my notes. I think I summarized it. And yeah, the idea of being placeless. Because you take that on, you make artifacts you have a sentence in your thesis that talks about, I'm paraphrasing, but about kind of hiding to be seen, the idea of you, so that you're seen as your person and not as the identity that's being projected on you, because that's another conversation, right? The idea of what we feel inside, what we belong to, and what the society projects on us as the identity, and the duality between the two and how they affect each other. So if you have any comments on that, and after that, I think Tammy has a question we can go to.
I mean, maybe I can speak to it, since I feel like when I was rambling, I ended up answering some of the questions, because it's just been on my mind kind of a lot this week. Oh shit, and now it just disappeared. My mind is blank.
Are we talking about the idea of placelessness?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Versus belonging to, like, it's a very fluid thing, right? The idea of belonging to a diaspora, being disconnected from a homeland, because diasporic existence is not just a geographical dislocation, it's also a temporal dislocation, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
So, and that kind of brings about a placelessness that's unique to itself. So if you have any comments on that, if the diasporic existence.
I remember, okay, so I remembered what I wanted to say. So I wanted to center on the idea of why I ended up choosing performance art as the kind of method of engaging with some of the issues that I had. And it's because in a lot of the research that I was doing, I mentioned this in my presentation, what my book captures is kind of the cusp of this ideological shift where I was trying to undo stuff that I had learned, where I was searching for an identity, where I was trying to find belonging, where I was trying to locate somewhere spatially or geographically or something, a feeling of belonging. And then as I read and researched more, I realized that the more you believe that it's somewhere outside of you, the harder it is to get to. It'll always be unattainable because even when you arrive at that place, it's quite elusive, I think, the idea of belonging personally. And so in the end, like as cheesy as it sounds, like it took me kind of reading all of this stuff and then looking back at myself and being like, oh, like in the end, it's navigating these boundaries in society as a fluid entity, like as someone that can be multiple things. And it's like really easy to say. You're like, oh yeah, like, I mean, that makes sense. But then how we conceive of ourselves and how it's like identity is often talked about in society is always as this static thing, like ways of being, and it has a deep philosophical lineage too, even in terms of like psychology. All of the ways that we phrase identity or talking about belonging, it's very static. And I found as I read more and tried to imagine it as being more fluid, it made me feel a little bit better. I was like, oh right, like I pass between being this and that more than the other, and it's not good or bad, like it's just kind of like I exist, I'm being all these things, and it's always like a negotiation of performance. So I talk about it in my book. There's a performance which is kind of there's like two kinds of performance, one that you knowingly take part of and then one that's viewed as inherent to you. And I think belonging is kind of navigating those two like facets of performance, where like by performing it, you reaffirm kind of the image-based stereotype of whatever racialized or gendered identity that you are identified as. But then in the end, as long as you acknowledge that it's performance and don't take it to heart, and you're like, okay, do you know what? No, this is like what I identify as, it's a fluid thing. That's kind of where I would say, like what my thesis literally was trying to navigate that through performance, literally. Just kind of like, yeah.
I like this concept of performance that you're talking about because I felt the same way when I was making my pieces. Ultimately, in the end, like I started to think of home and my identity as this unfolding event that, depending on the time that I make the piece in and the materials that I have at the time and the landscape that I chose and the weather at that location, wherever it is, it changes. Like if I were to make these pieces again exactly the same way, I wouldn't be able to. And I think that says a lot about the fluidity of identity that you're talking about, Jess, which ultimately is true of identity. It's very fluid. It's not like the notion that identity is fixed is a very big illusion, and kind of realizing that that's what it is at the end of the day, you know, was really, it was almost freeing in a sense. Like you don't have to be just one thing or the other, you know, you can go back and forth. You know, at times you might feel more one than the other, depending on where you are, what you're doing. Yeah.
For me, this idea of place or placelessness with the Sukkah was me trying to like assert myself and find, I guess, meaning within that place, and by being very visible. But ultimately, I ended up titling my thesis "Still Wandering" in the sense of that I asserted myself very loudly, I guess, for lack of a better word, by like placing my sukkah on school property, being like, hi, I'm here, I'm a Jewish woman, like this is very visible and very different from what I'm used to and how I'm used to existing, I guess. So even though there was an attempt of rooting myself in something, I still felt like there's constant work to be done, and it's always going, so hence the still wandering for me.
Great. Tammy, do you want to ask your question now?
Yeah, this dovetails in perfectly, actually. I think, you know, what all three of you have highlighted is something really important. All of you have kind of investigated yourself and identity through different, not just research or archival, but through research creation. You've made things to kind of think about these issues, and, you know, proactively you've used tools from your architecture education to empower yourselves to synthesize material and somehow relate that to identity. And in reality, it's an identity that sometimes we feel compelled to justify, to acknowledge, to carve out, to legitimize, because our identities are never mentioned. They're never present. They're never acknowledged. They're not real because they're not in our education. So it's important that I say this. And it's important that I ask each of you to reflect on this notion and to reflect on the slightly derogatory term that's tossed around about theses like these when they're called backyard theses. And we tend to overcompensate and apologize for them, or be defensive, or justify them. And rather than that, what I'd like you to do is turn that term on its head and use this as an opportunity to critique the term, critique pedagogy, critique our profession that has led you to a position where all three of you felt so compelled that you had to use the only moment in your education to figure out who you were.
Great question.
It is. Yeah. I think like a big part of why I wanted to do my thesis on identity is because I felt like it was something that I always wanted to explore through design and making in undergrad, but never really had the chance to. Like, I feel like I always had this urge to like maybe even just have like one studio project where the site was maybe somewhere other than Canada or, you know, Europe or something like that. So I feel like, yeah, it was definitely missing for me. That's why I had this, you know, like I instantly knew that I wanted to do my thesis on my identity because of that.
I do want to add that, you know, when the term backyard thesis is used, I find it offensive, because there's a deep insinuation that there's an othering to the person. There's an immediate othering. It's immediately racialized. I think it's a very racialized and othering of people's experiences.
In Robert Young's defense, he doesn't use that term to only for students of color, right? It's a term that he uses when the work is very personal. So that is what I'll add there, but continue. Jess and Danielle, do you want to add to the pedagogical question?
Here, this might be a little rambly, and I'm not sure how much everyone here will be able to relate to it, because obviously I did my undergrad at a different school, which of course comes with its own set of problems. In terms of, so I was like part of the charter class, and a lot of, as I mentioned in the prologue, is that a lot of what I felt my undergraduate education kind of pushed for was phenomenology and critical regionalism. And so when I came out of my undergraduate, I kind of questioned if critical regionalism kind of was the best approach to tackle cultures mixing, because it has the word critical in it, right? So like there must be some nuance associated with it that isn't just like straight regionalism, which is like nostalgic and traditional and that kind of stuff. But I think the issue that I, like every time I got confronted with what critical regionalism might look like, it was always, you have to take an othered community and bash it against modernism. Make it concrete, make it a modern material that wasn't from its place of origin, and that's how you would create architecture that was suddenly consciously mixing culture is. And I took some issue with that, because in the end, it's still setting up a hierarchy where modernism or like those kinds of materials are the default that you have to mix with an othered kind of culture. And then that mixing is what makes it critical. I was kind of, I guess, confused overall. And to me, it still set up kind of a really confusing hierarchy. And so even if you're doing that, conscious of those kind of contradictions in that process, I think in the end, it'll always feel like tokenism. And this is kind of like the opinion that I've come to, is that in architecture, it'll always feel like tokenism until the system that it's operating under, like the hierarchy that it's operating under, is completely dismantled or questioned, or because like you just kind of incorporating cultures, it'll always feel like that unless you learn to respect and understand kind of the cultures and view it at the same platform or at the same level. And so like that's what I came into this thesis, and that's why I almost felt like so confused, because but then ended up not doing something that was more architectural. So I guess I was like unsure how to even tackle architecture that would grapple with these questions in a way that wasn't critical regionalism, right? Like, how do you even do that? And it's a question I think I'll be asking for the rest of my life, unless we decide to dismantle like the patriarchy and stuff overnight. But anyways, so maybe it's one of you two.
So just you don't feel like your thesis was architectural, or like
not in the traditional sense. I mean,
the big question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how other people see their theses, because I was always like when I was presenting the pieces in the gallery, a lot of people thought that my project was an MFA instead of an MArch, and I had to constantly like justify to them and to myself, like, actually it deals with space, it's inspired by this and that. But yeah, it's such an interesting question to ask, like, how would you classify pieces as architectural? Like, what is architecture? What makes a piece architectural? Is it a building, or is it enough that you're just kind of dealing with space? Yeah.
I definitely had a similar issue in terms of people. Less so after I actually built the stucca, but beforehand, when I was talking about my family, they're like, how's this architecture? And to kind of go back to your question, Tammy, I think like kind of after our undergraduate training, or any architectural undergraduate training, the way that you see the world inherently is through the lens of what you've been taught and what you've trained to do. So when I was thinking about my family and their stories, I would argue that I was thinking of it through an architectural lens, thinking about spatially how they occupy specific buildings, kind of dismantling, I guess, what a building means in relation to a person and vice versa. And for me, when I started my thesis, even with the other thesis concept, I knew that I wouldn't be able to get through my degree if I didn't do something that was very personal and something that I was passionate in. And it kind of, ultimately turned out to be a very personal thesis. And I honestly, I don't know if I could have done it any other way. And so your kind of idea of backyard being othering is interesting, because I guess like this is the only way I can see it going. Sorry, I'm rambling too, but yeah.
No, you're not. But I think this brings up a lot of questions that I think a lot of us have asked, myself included, about how to bring conversations like this into architecture with a capital A, right? It's very difficult. And as the school's kind of looking at changing the curriculum, that's the question that keeps coming up. Like, where is the line? Like, how do you go about this? There's the worldview that is the kind of Western worldview that everything is operating on. So do we just keep that, or like, do we have to go down to dismantling the whole basis? And I think I would like to see if you can comment on this, because you all kind of gravitate towards more installation and art projects. And as Jess said, I think, like Jess said it, because she kind of didn't know what to do. She kind of in her thesis talks about how she thought about making a library. Like, what do you do a cultural center? Like, how do you go about doing this? So I kind of want to talk about that, like the fact that art creates this ability to kind of bring up these questions, whereas it feels like architecture has its limitations, or it does the way we're practicing it today. So if you want to talk about that.
Such a
I
big.
think, oh, sorry, Danielle, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Annie.
I was gonna say, I think like initially in my thesis, I knew from the start that I wanted to create an installation just for mainly for one thing, which is scale. Like I wanted to create something where I can build with my own hands and have control over the materials and kind of really connect with it with my body, like really being aware of my body as, you know, in terms of like relative, in terms of scale to the thing that I was making, and work closely with the materials. So that's why I always went about it that way and called it an art installation. But then like throughout my thesis, I was thinking about that. Like, I know there are spaces in the world that are super tiny, like people, if you guys remember that project that we did in undergrad, the case study, like the Kowloon Walled City, like people were living in spaces that were just as big as the carpets that I was kind of creating. So it's like, what's the difference? Like I was asking myself, like, what's the difference between art and architecture throughout my thesis? Which, I mean, ultimately you can't really answer that because they are so interwoven. At least for me, they felt like they were. So, yeah, I still struggle to kind of think about my work in one way or the other. Yeah, it falls kind of in between. What do you think, Danielle? Because you also did something that you were able to build yourself that was small enough that you could construct all by your own, like you don't need.
And it's the most architectural of the three.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say I think of my stucco probably less art than architecture, just because it is a temporary dining pavilion, for lack of a better comparison. I'm not sure.
We can skip, like you don't have to answer, but yeah.
Can we come back?
It's one of those questions
Yeah.
that's like really hard to answer. Like, don't worry,
Yeah.
like it's one of those
It's
questions that you
impossible,
could
yeah.
ask yourself for years. At least for me, it was. I still don't know like what's, you know,
Yeah,
how
I
to
think
answer that question.
the most confusing thing is that you go like again, from my own perspective, you kind of go through architecture learning that everything can be architecture. Like the
Yeah,
action of design, right? And then you get to
Making.
masters, and then you do something that's like slightly not a building, and you're like, oh no, what's that? Where's the line
You
here?
freak out.
It's not just you, it's also people around you. Like anyone
Yeah,
who
it was mostly the
can have an
people.
opinion has an opinion on things not being architectural enough. Yeah.
But I think
For me, like it felt like always people were always the ones who kind of like raised that anxiety in me, like is what I'm doing architectural enough? Or it was never me kind of doing it, because to me it definitely was like I was making things, I was looking at architecture as a reference. I was creating space and spatial experiences, which to me is architectural. And you know, for me, anything that's 3D can be architecture. It's just a matter of scale and experience, I guess.
so like one of the so like maybe I'll just like build off of kind of my answer to the previous question in why I didn't do a building. It's also like, so there's like, it was kind of twofold. So I just kind of realized that most of academia is just kind of playing pretend, right? You make up a client, you make up a situation, and then you kind of react to it. And in the end, as long as you're operating in an academic setting, you're going to be playing pretend with all of these different components of the design that'll always kind of feel dissatisfying. Like in the end, you can only imagine how a community might react or how it might be built or that kind of stuff. And that's like the wonder of academia. Like you can dream and do whatever you want and that kind of stuff. But in the end, it also starts to feel a little hollow.
Yeah.
I think by the time you get to your master's, you're like, damn, like, do I have to do this again? And I think the other, like, maybe, again, this is a thought that I've had, is that, and I think it runs through anyone that ends up not doing a building for their thesis, is that we all also realize that a building won't solve the problem in a single sort of absolute way, right? And then that almost becomes like this, like, to me, that's, it puts you in a position where you almost don't know how to do anything, right? Like how you move forward if the building doesn't solve the issue. But in the end, like I did this thesis personally as like knowing that I wanted to continue to practice in architecture. And so to me, it was like kind of coming to terms with the stuff that felt like it was holding me back as a person, stuff that I wanted to be addressed in my own education and wanted to speak about outwardly before I had to go into practice and kind of confront these things at a kind of a real way and like make change that would amount to communities being affected in buildings, that kind of stuff. Like I think for myself, it was like taking a step back, realizing that a building wasn't going to solve the problem that I was like trying to do, because like how do you do that? But in the end, realizing that there's like the design is definitely like when you learn in architecture is like how to design, like how to use past like to elicit action in the present, and then like your design is like a future idea, right? Like you're like working towards something. So like I don't know, that's the way I kind of see it, I guess. Trying to comfort myself at night. But, yeah.
Also, the thesis, just building on your point, Jessica, like making up the undergrad, itinerary and the whatever was needed in the building. For me, kind of deciding to do a very personal thesis was kind of a way to take ownership of my architectural education and reframe it in a way that made sense to me personally. That was something that I could, fully get behind and understand it from a very vulnerable perspective.
That makes sense. And that brings us to another thing that we talked amongst ourselves about, which we kind of pointed out, is the idea of being a visible minority versus an invisible minority, and what is being put on you and what you project out into the world as a connection to that. So, and then also being a woman in all of this narrative. Jess, you kind of really bring in a lot of feminist theory in your discussion, and you position yourself very much as a biracial woman who's been othered, cis woman. And Danielle and Henning, you don't explicitly bring in feminism, but it's heavily implied. So not to become one of those, like, I don't want this to become one of those conversations on panels where it's like, what is the role of women in architecture? And like, it becomes this like white feminist ramble, but kind of
why
looking
not?
at it.
We need those kind of questions.
No, we do, but I don't want it to become one of those like one notes moments where we kind of forget about the intersectionality of the situation, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if you want to add to that, if you have any comments on the visible versus invisible being united, like being a portion of the identity being, I'm having trouble articulating, as you can see. But yeah, but this kind of brings up, like anecdotally, I remember like with Danielle, something that always like really ticks her off is people kind of talking about Christmas and assuming she like celebrates Christmas just because she's like a white woman. But so these kind of intersections and the privileges that each has, and in and how you bring that into your work.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I'm, and speaking about privilege, I identify as white. Yet I'm a minority, so it's kind of this kind of unique position to be in. I don't get othered because of how I look, but othered in kind of a different way, I guess you could say. Yeah, that was to thanks for calling me out, Denise. Yeah, like around Christmas time, it's always been hard for me because growing up, that was never my holiday. It was something that my family didn't celebrate. On Christmas, we went to the movies, and it was just something that was very different. Like being called Scrooge because of that, it was shocking for me in university. I think that was also another element of why for me my thesis was important to me to write, just coming from this perspective that maybe other people might not be aware of. Considering people have different backgrounds and different cultures, races, whatever, that need to be accounted for and considered, even if, like me, it's not necessarily visible. And I think just in my way of contributing to that story helped make me feel like I guess I was making a difference in like the larger discourse of at least Waterloo architecture and kind of how to approach identity in terms of a thesis.
Yeah, it kind of feels like in order to make anything that makes a difference, like that quote that I was talking about in my presentation, like creating an object of encounter that literally changes the way people look at certain things, you know, different cultures, people who are otherized, things like that, versus creating an object that just represents something. That was like a topic that I was looking at as well. And going back to what Penise was saying about like my thesis having that kind of subtle, I guess like touches subtly on feminism and being a visible minority, like it might have not been literal. And in the beginning, I was thinking of doing it literally. I was looking at like people of color and refugees and things in the beginning of my thesis, but eventually what ended up happening was I was looking at all these artists who, without doing it literally, well, some of them did, but the ones that I felt were the most, the ones that resonated with me the most were doing it almost like subconsciously as they created the work. And I made sure that at one point, that I was only looking at works by people who are people of color, women, and people who identify as queer, in hopes of like learning from their experiences in terms of like, how do you make to kind of show that? And I kind of was trying to learn from them. So that was one way for me to kind of connect with those topics through my work, because it is really important to me as a woman and as a person of color and a visible minority to kind of touch on that. So my precedents were definitely my way of kind of diving into that.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, sure.
This is what I was hinting at. This is what I was hinting at. And so my concern about pedagogy wasn't just content, that the content is overloaded and exclusively, you know, to the Western canon or whatever. My concern is that you haven't been given the tools of methodology outside of the Western world. So I'm so happy to see that, you know, you're each finding different ways to find this. But, you know, as someone who teaches, this is problematic, right? That you have to search for this, and you only search for it in your graduate degree, and you don't get a chance to be exposed to different methodologies in your undergraduate, or even get the chance to search and explore in your undergraduate. And I think that, you know, that's the kind of critique. And I'm so happy to see all three of you and how you've like found on your own, like you've taught yourself how to learn. And yes, I see what you're saying in some ways, Danielle, that, you know, you couldn't have seen it any other way, because I was like you. I couldn't have seen it any other way. I had to teach myself, and by doing that I learned a lot. But I can't help but think, no, there's got to be something else here. There's got to be another way than us being forced to learn other methodologies. And I'm glad to hear this, Haneen, that you had kind of a particular lens for how you chose your precedents. I think that that's very telling. But like I think about Jess's comment about, you know, with critical regionalism becomes kind of a metaphor for what we're all doing, right? It's like a mashup. To justify the othering, we have to mash it up with some Western text or some Western word or some Western material to somehow legitimize it. And, you know, to me, this is like still problematic. And I don't have the answer. I don't pretend to have the answer, but I'm happy to see so much criticality.
I was very aware of that, because if any of you guys read my book, like a lot of my references in terms of writing were Deleuze and like French philosophers, but I did that very consciously. I wanted to use them because I mean, I took Derek's elective and I was very familiar with the text. So I'm like, you know how earlier I was talking about the idea of using someone with a different perspective as a mediator in order to be able to step outside of yourself and look at yourself objectively. And for me, that was my way of doing that. I hope that came across in my book. But yeah, in terms of like the bigger, like that was just for the writing, but for the making, definitely the references that I used were all the artists. Like I probably looked at like 50 different artists and made sure that they're super diverse and different from different countries and all that. But
unpacking that is so interesting.
And interestingly enough, like a lot of them are people that are so famous. Like when I look at their body of work now, it's like, how did we not know about this person? Like, this is crazy. Like
exactly.
Like I felt ashamed as someone who grew up, you know, loving art and thinking that I knew so much about art and architecture, but mostly art. I was looking at mostly at art in my thesis. That I knew, you know, like names and I mean, I memorized in high school, like names and dates of like paintings from the Renaissance, so all of that. But
the canon.
Yeah,
It's all we know is the canon.
But I almost had to teach myself all this stuff now, you know, and it was kind of disappointing. I felt kind of ashamed that, you know, that I didn't know these people before. You know, out of the 50 artists that I looked at, a lot of them were people that whose work I've never seen before, which was kind of disappointing.
And that's the thing, like when you put the onus on the person of color to go do that work for themselves, the guilt comes with it, the shaming comes with it, but the anger also comes with it. And then it feels like we need to go read Deleuze to be able to justify our placement. Because like, is there an Iraqi Deleuze? No, because no Iraqi person would write Deleuze.
I mean, no, I disagree with that. There is like I just want to clarify that. Like comparing myself to people who studied architecture in Iraq, for example, like my aunt is an Iraqi architect. She studied in Baghdad and all of that. Like when you talk to them and ask them like, well, who was the reference for your thesis? And like a lot of them were like amazing people with amazing bodies of work and whose books we should definitely have in our school. I definitely struggled. There's one Iraqi historian and architect. His name is Ihsan Fathi, and he's like the expert, like the go-to person on Iraqi, traditional Iraqi courtyard houses. And I was not able to find his book like anywhere, like in any of the libraries, unless I bought it and someone was like selling it on eBay for like, I don't know, like $300 or something crazy like that. So it was kind of shocking for me that we didn't have access to things like that. It's not that they don't exist. They exist, but we don't have access to them.
But even when you kind of talk to people who study architecture in other parts of the world, you realize how pervasive the Western canon is. Like they read Deleuze and Foucault and whoever else, like that, which is disheartening, right? It's hard to
like anyone you ask in any country will know who Le Corbusier is, like any architecture student.
Yeah,
but they might
which is fine. It's fine. They should know, but they also should know who Sinan is. Right? Like go talk about Corbusier, but also talk about Sinan. Like, yeah. I
had to teach myself about Mimar Sinan just through like my own visitations. And
Tammy taught me about Mimar Sinan. I'm very excited about it.
It's just shocking that like all these people we don't really know about, and we can definitely learn a lot from.
Yeah, it's content, but it's methodology. And I think this is always the thing I'm going to struggle with, right? Is I keep learning. I still keep learning. And I'm learning by listening to all three of you. You've shared so many wonderful different ways of synthesizing material. And I just feel like I hope this is an amazing forum. So I got to keep coming to these. But you have to keep sharing them with your school, because in a way, I think you will lead shifts in pedagogy. I think that that's really important.
Okay. I have more questions I can keep going through if you want to, like, does anyone else have questions? Because we're like starting to lose people and I want to make sure if people have something to say, they say it.
I do have a question actually.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. I've rambled a bunch, or I've written down some kind of disorienting notes, but I'll try to make this coherent. But I was wondering, first, thank you all for your presentations. I really appreciate all of them. But I was wondering if you could all speak more about stories, actually, how you all draw from stories that frame our identities and our built worlds, and also how stories often exclude us or exclude the ways we see space or understand space. And I think this draws from Tammy's questions or Tammy's comments as well a little bit. But I think I see all of your theses as kind of unearthing or dismantling or rewriting the stories, kind of that frame us, right? And so I think the way that in my own work that I connect this to the work of architecture or design is that I think at the end of the day, we translate our experiences, our education, our stories into the built world in some way. Like everything kind of gets translated through us, right? So it's interesting because I think a lot of us who are excluded from mainstream stories feel the need to reconcile those stories through our work, like, or our theses. And I can at least, like, that's how I've felt in my own work. And I know, yeah, so if you could all kind of, I know Danielle talks a lot about stories in her thesis and, or kind of frames her thesis in that way. But I guess Haneen and Jess, you don't use that language explicitly, but ultimately that's what you're doing as well, right? So yeah, I just wondered if you could all maybe comment on that, or thank you.
I think for me, like, stories kind of came into play early in my thesis because that's what I was basing my work on in the beginning. I was kind of listening to my parents' own stories about these houses because I didn't have they're not very well documented. So a lot of me relying on stories came in that way. So stories about the rituals that took place in the courtyard houses and in modern mid-century houses in Baghdad, and all of that were all based on stories. And then ultimately the pieces that I created at the end are kind of the retelling of my own story. So for me, that's kind of how stories came into play. But it's very key. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do my thesis the way that I did without stories. Like, if you take the stories out, I wouldn't have a thesis.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my thesis was so, like you said, story heavy. For me, kind of a realization that I came to, and also just, again, to bring it back to the title of my thesis was Still Wandering Tales from the Diaspora, is that I started thinking about a story versus a tale. And the stories that we're told, are some version of the truth, and eventually they kind of become the truth themselves, even if they aren't necessarily what is true. Is this idea of tales kind of becoming the truth rather than stories. Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer, like, for me personally, about exclusion. I don't think I'm necessarily the best person to answer that question. Yeah.
I guess I'll offer some thoughts. And even kind of touching on the last question as well, is that so in mine, I was actually, like, Derek was trying to pull stories out of me. Like, he kept asking me for more personal analogies. And at some point, it, like, kind of what I discussed before, like, how much, like, for me, it's, like, quite difficult to try to center, like, on stories that I would want to tell or want to share in these sorts of forums for people. And that's, like, for my own experience, my own difficulty reconnecting with one half of my family. So my dad's, like, my parents are divorced, and so my dad's kind of out of the picture. So I don't have someone to kind of go through or go to kind of understand. And he's the one that's a Chinese Vietnamese. And so, like, all of my kind of racialized experience, that would kind of be the direction that I would try to draw stories from, try to understand, and then try to embrace or confront. If I imagined framing my thesis through stories, because in the end, I've heard, like, in terms of my mom's stories, like, she came from communist Czechoslovakia. They kind of obliterated religion and that kind of stuff. So there's a form of erasure there that's more systematic and more institutionalized. And then just from personal erasure, by not having contact with my dad, it was kind of, I was like, oh gosh, like, which way do I go? And then in the end, like, I ended up relying super heavily on theory, and specifically, like, Eurocentric, like, philosophy. Like, I read a couple books. There's one guy named Hui K. Baba, and it's great just to, like, read his work. And it's, like, one of, like, the most critical texts because it offers a perspective on these things that references, like, Frantz Fanon and like all of these other really kind of essential like, canonical authors. And so for me, that was how, like, I saw the theory as a story, because I wasn't able to find my own. And in the end, to me, they were, like I mentioned it, I use the word fictions as well. Like, we construct fictions to better understand our place in society, and we abide by certain fictions more than others and that kind of stuff. And so that's kind of how I saw it, as, like, I was constructing my own fiction to kind of deal with or come to terms with some of the issues that I was finding.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was trying to get at, actually. Like, that I think the canon is a story. Like, if you think of stories as a narrative being told from a specific perspective, like, I think our educational system is a story being told to, like, the canon, like the Western canon is a story, right? Or at least this is how I think about it. And then but also our own cultural contexts. Like those are stories that we understand and that shape who we are, right? So I guess in asking this question, I was kind of thinking to frame, like if you think, I mean, kind of say like everything is a story, right? Everything that makes us who we are, or how we behave, or how we conduct our lives, like is kind of building on the stories that we know, or that we've been told, or that we tell ourselves. And so I think it's interesting because I really do see like, and like I was kind of trying to get to it, like how we rewrite those stories, or how we reframe those, like the stories for ourselves. Anyway, I don't really have a point, but I think it's just really interesting to see how I think you've all really addressed that in interesting ways. So
if I can offer just another quick thought.
Yeah.
And so much of storytelling is related to language. I mean, I'm sure that's come up in all of our research, like just like how essential language is, like whether it be in oral or written form, and then how you teach that, or how you perceive that, or how you interpret it is so much of learning to research, and like learning to understand. And even in terms of like, I mean, like empathy, like you have to be able to relate to the language. And that's kind of actually one of the more difficult things that I encountered, is because as a person that's kind of like atheist, that doesn't have exposure to communities or cultures, like in terms of the language that I communicate with, it's so English centric that I kind of gravitated to texts that were picking apart the English language in a really, really critical way, and trying to understand where I sat in relation to that as the language that I speak. And so that's kind of like, as I was going through, I realized that that's kind of what I was gravitating towards, because it was the language that I could best understand, or like start to pick apart these ideas critically.
And I think this is a great segue into the process of writing, because I think this is something that Danielle really addresses too in her thesis, the idea of language and like bringing in words that are not English. Like I remember when you were writing your thesis, there was a whole discussion about like, do I italicize them? Do I like, is that like giving it power, or is it taking away from the power? Is it others?
I had the same thoughts too.
Yeah. So I think a lot of us who have dealt with theses around these questions have felt these things, and the way you go about writing these stories becomes a big part of it. So if any of you has any thoughts about that, the act of writing as a process, as well as the act of making, and how the two kind of interact with each other. Because I think for all of you, the relationship between the writing and the making has been different. Like I think with Jess, you're like, it's kind of intertwined. They both informed each other. With Heneen, I would make the argument, maybe I'm wrong, that like the bigger product of your thesis was the artifacts, the installations. And with Danielle, it's kind of like different, because your sukkah becomes kind of the result of the research that you have done, whereas like the actual book of the storytelling is a huge part of what you create. So it's kind of interesting to also talk about the book and the writing as a product, and how you go about doing that, and how you choose the language around it.
How did you guys feel about the writing? Like, I know for me, it was probably my biggest anxiety, and I definitely avoided it until the very end, which I later regretted, because it actually like solidified a lot of things for me. And I discovered that I actually also think through writing, not just through making. Mm-hmm. But like, how did you guys feel about that? Like, was the writing, like what preceded what, the making or the writing, or, you know, since we all wrote and made stuff?
Yeah, I would almost treat writing sometimes as like very therapeutic, almost diary entries, where I just write like little snippets of what I was feeling, be like, okay, that's going in the thesis somehow. And I ultimately built my sukkah before I wrote the entire book, but I think, Panise, you're right, like they're kind of almost two artifacts, even though the sukkah is in the book. For me, writing was so important, and I love to write personally, and that was one of the reasons why I came back to Waterloo, to have the opportunity to write what I wanted as much as I wanted. In terms of the language, there were a lot of terms that I was using that I knew that the reader wouldn't necessarily be familiar with. I think what I ended up doing in the end was italicizing my words after a discussion with Panise, just because I guess they weren't English, I included a glossary at the back. And I think where I felt it, like if you didn't have the context of that word, I would kind of have a little brief layout of what that meant. Otherwise, I just wrote as if I would speak. And it was an interesting exercise because, I mean, so often in my life, I find I'm editing myself when I'm speaking about my family or my, celebrations, holidays. I would say, my grandfather this, but I don't actually call him grandfather.
Yeah, it feels weird.
Yeah. So being able to write in a way that was very true to myself, kind of also empowered me to speak that way just in life in general. Like I feel a lot more comfortable now being like, oh yeah, I'm just going over to my Zeta's house. And if someone doesn't know, then the onus is on them to ask, not for me to explain.
So mine was, I was looking a lot at how people subvert language, but in the end, I ended up writing a fairly well-written standard academic paper.
I would disagree with that, but keep going.
Okay. So I mean, the biggest subversion I think I did is I made like verbs nouns, and like really struggled to figure out which verbs would be nouns in some cases to imply a process of non-static dynamic movement fluidity. But it's something that I'm always like questioning, because like the second that you take away, let's say, some of the more syntactical stuff about language, like if you were to write the entire thing without punctuation or not capitalize everything, is that a subversion? You're still writing in English. Like these are all tactics that people use to kind of break up. Like even Deleuze uses like and as a word that would just like group together ideas, and it's like and in a way that almost like kind of subverts language in a more grammatical sense, which I like really enjoyed. But the I think what I was trying to capture actually in a lot of the writing in my book is, and I struggled to write, I saved it till the end, and I wrote it in a month and a half at the very end, and it was just like, because the rest of the thesis had just been like, I think what you mentioned, Danielle, like little snippets, and then they get kind of angry, and I'm like, this is a bit of a rant, I should admit this. And then I like tossed up, and then I like ended up going in, and then I kind of like worked through and unpacked the ideas a little more, which is what turned into the thesis. But for myself, the biggest issue with language was that I was always trying to locate how do you locate yourself when talking about these things? So in academic writing, you're trying to produce an objective statement, so you locate yourself outside of the argument, and it's devoid of all you, right? And then if you're telling a story, right, like you have to be in the story, so you're embodied and you use the word I. Versus if you use the word she, you start to objectify yourself. You're looking at yourself from further away. And so in my thesis, you can see all three of those used, because I'm freaking out and I don't know which one is the better one to use, because I'm trying to occupy all of those positions, because I'm trying to see stuff from a more objective point of view that allows me to unpack the ideas without it becoming a rant. I mean, some of them are rants, but it's like less rant.
But I think you do it beautifully. It's done in such a deliberate way. Like there's a sentence somewhere in the beginning that you talk about the I becoming the she. And it's just like, boom, within that statement, you're capturing, you're capturing the whole premise of what you're talking about. Identity as something that's being imposed on you versus something you feel. And I think you do subvert language in what you do, both with the way you physically like treat words as objects on the page. It's like your book itself is very much an artifact. I recommend people go read all of your books, because I think they're all brilliant. But I think Jess's treatment of language is quite unique in how she goes about it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, like I just wanted to also mention, and this might be something that comes up for multiple people, is that I meant it in like a proper academic ways, because I use what my mom would call big words, and then my family cannot understand what I am trying to communicate to them, and I spent my entire thesis trying to describe what my thesis was about. And they read the book and they were just more confused than ever. But then through the conversation in my defense, my family ended up understanding what I was saying, because it's like conversational. So there was like that whole disconnect that I was like unable to communicate to my family, but to academics or to other people in this that had gone through this education, it's clearer the language I'm using. So
and I think that's something Danielle does really well. She writes in a way that like I think anyone can pick it up and completely it captures the essence of what she's trying to get at. So yeah, that's why
and it feels the most like a story. Like I really enjoyed reading it because it felt like someone was telling me a story, and it was like very captivating.
And you have that too, honey, but you kind of like go in and out of kind of adding.
Yeah, a little bit.
There,
I mean, I used a little bit of theory as well, but yeah.
Okay, I don't want to like take too much time and people are kind of dropping. So I want to address one more question that I think is something important to talk about. And then if there's nothing else, we can just party here until people want to leave. So one thing that Haneen kind of alluded to, and it kind of came up in the conversation, is the role of a mediator in the thesis. And he talked about, I think Jess also talked about it, the idea of finding some other, like a theory or something to kind of use to mediate across and kind of capture your biases. But I also think like a supervisor, committee members are like very important mediators in this too. And so I want to talk about whether it's even a possibility to be unbiased when you write a thesis like that, how you go about choosing the right mediators, and how is it necessary? Do we even need to be thinking about it this way? Maybe it's better to just like delve into the nitty-gritty of our emotions? And also kind of bring into this the idea of the importance of the relationships you build during the writing your thesis or working on your thesis, the relationship you develop with other people's work at the school, or the friends around, the discussions, because I think all these things become building blocks and give you kind of ways to approach your work. So if you can talk to any of this. If I'm not clear in my question, let me know. I kind of combined several questions on my list.
Yeah, so that was like mediators in our work versus our supervisors who could also be mediators.
Exactly. And
like
also,
my mediator. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and also fellow students, I think, can be good mediators.
Yeah. People in your studio even.
Yeah.
I know that a lot of the Deleuze references I used was because Derek was my first committee member and my TRD2 instructor, which heavily kind of exposed me to that material that I wouldn't have otherwise maybe approached myself or been interested in. But
your precedents are also your mediators, right? You do extensive
research. For sure. I'd say the precedents are the art, like the contemporary artists. I would say that was the main research that I did and the main precedents that I've used. I'm just trying to think of like how your supervisor can kind of play a role in how your thesis kind of unfolds, which I think they play a huge part in that. So I guess for me, like Derek being my committee member, it really kind of allowed me to dive into the Deleuze material. Sorry, I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm just thinking out loud, like how the supervisor can kind of affect your thesis.
Danielle, you had co-supervisors. I think that's a quite unique place to be. So
yeah, I had Andrew Levitt and Robert Jan van Pelt as my co-supervisors, and I actually started with Robert Jan as my single supervisor when I was doing my original thesis topic, and I brought in Andrew kind of later on. We were doing a reading elective, and I was telling him about my thesis, and he was like, this sounds really interesting. Do you have a supervisor yet? And I was like, do you want to be my co-supervisor? And I think for me, having two people kind of at the same level coming from different places was almost like my mediation. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that's why I went less for the route of theory, because I already had some voices. But I think it really helped me between the two of them when I brought something to one of them and I wanted to kind of, second opinion, get it from the other one. Or if I brought them together, it was interesting to hear their opinions bouncing off of each other. Honestly, for a lot of it, for the writing, they kind of left me alone because I almost asked to be left alone. For me, I don't remember if it was Jessica or Haneen in our previous conversation when we were planning for this event. One of you had mentioned that using a mediator kind of in terms of like moderating your thinking and to kind of give you like an anchor point almost. And for me, I totally went the opposite way, and it's a really interesting way for me to think of it, whichever of you expressed that, because I was like, I don't want to hear anyone else. I want to be in this bubble and I want to write. Please leave me alone. I'll send you chapter 1 when it's done.
But you did that for certain parts of your thesis, right? Like not for the whole thing. Because I did that as well for the making part of my thesis. I felt like I was kind of, I mean, Rick Andrighetti was my supervisor and he was the person I was meeting with every 2 weeks. But at certain points, because I was experimenting so much and like having to catch him up every 2 weeks about what I was doing, at a certain point, he just kind of trusted me doing it on my own. So for me, my making, the making portion of my thesis was on my own, but the writing was kind of inspired by the class that I took, the Deleuze class that I took with Derek.
Yeah, for me, the making was when I would be speaking with my supervisors more often. After my Suka, I kind of took chunks of 2 months to write each of my 3 chapters. And when it was done, each chapter I just sent it to them. I was like, here, take a week. Is it okay? They're like, keep going. And that was just my experience because maybe, I don't know, my personal affinity for writing, I was just like, I can do this. I'm good. Like, if there's anything wrong, let me know. But I think it really depends on how you approach your thesis and what your strengths are going into your thesis, and what you need from your mediators or your supervisors, because I think every thesis is different and everyone's going to need something different in relation to that.
It's interesting. I mean, like, I'll comment quickly. So I mean, Derek Revington was my supervisor, and I remember the first, I would say, like, term that I was, or not, like, so the first term that I was with him as my supervisor was my M2 TRD2 term, and I was also taking his elective simultaneously, and I remember the first few meetings I had with him, I was like, what language is this man speaking? Because he speaks almost exclusively in Deleuze jargon, and so then I took the elective, and then I could finally understand what he was talking about. And then, like, my entire thesis just became, like, trying to understand what Derek was talking about at the time. A lot of our meetings were me sitting silently and listening to him ramble, and then he would get self-conscious and ask me if I had something to contribute. And I'm like, no, it's okay. And then he'd continue rambling. So you'll see that I internalized a lot of his Deleuze, like, because I actually think it was an interesting framework to go through and, like, understand why he was using it and why he continues to tout it to students as, like, a framework to view your thesis through. And then I was also thinking, like, I looked at a lot of artists, but didn't put them into my book as much as I think Haneen did in terms of precedents. I just kind of mentioned 2 artists that I thought were interesting at the end, but I found that like, just like kind of being exposed, like I didn't have much exposure to art, and then like using this as an opportunity to just like kind of delve into exploring different magazines or different artists that were exploring these kinds of difficult topics that were outside of architecture. That was kind of what I would consider my mediators, is like stuff that wasn't necessarily architectural but super related and all about trying to deal with these like issues in ways that were in architecture. And then I'm hoping I can take that and use this thesis as a mediator for my like going out into practice architecture and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
This is also interesting because I think, oh, sorry, do you want to say something? Yeah.
I'll just say one more thing in case you're going to change the topic after. I was just going to say that, like, I think everybody who's done a thesis has experienced this at a certain point, like in the beginning, TRD1, TRD2. Yes, we rely heavily on our supervisors and our studio instructors for ideas and for, methodologies and kind of references and things like that. But I think everybody gets to a certain point where you become the expert on your own topic, even more so than your supervisors and your committee members, because you're spending so much more time working on it and exclusively working on it, it's just like, it was kind of interesting for me to kind of get to that point, like having a mediator who's led me the whole time, and then to getting to a point all of a sudden where I was kind of the expert and I was on my own, and that's how it should be towards the end as well.
I agree. And I just wanted to add that I think it's interesting because between the 3 of you, Danielle is the only one who had supervisors who reflect, like who could identify with what you were writing, right? You had two Jewish supervisors, whereas the rest of us, I'm putting myself on the spot, like there is no opportunity to have like Muslim hijabi woman or like anyone relevant to the discussion be your supervisor. And I think that is also a big part of it, like the person you're dealing with, if that person is knowledgeable about what you're trying to talk about. And it becomes a struggle sometimes trying to communicate what's happening to you. And I think, I don't know if any of you have felt like gaslighted or anything during the process, because sometimes you start questioning yourself, like, wait, if what I'm saying correct? Or like, you know, it kind of goes back to Tammy's larger question of pedagogy, right?
And you kind of crave that guidance too. Like, I wish I had someone who knew what I was talking about in terms of like in the beginning, my, you know, things about my identity, and especially when I was looking at the courtyard houses stuff, I wish I had like an expert, like that prof that I mentioned, Hassan Fathi, who could just like tell me information without me having to like kind of look at it and teach myself the whole thing. And I think I just went along with like supervisors that we had at school. But towards the end, I wanted to make sure that at least one person in my panel could identify with my thesis. And I made sure that my external was a Muslim hijabi woman of color.
It's funny,
just to add to the conversation.
You ended up with an Iranian external, I ended up with an Iraqi external.
Yeah, but she had so much insight into, because she, like, as I was telling the stories, even though she's Persian, she could identify with like some of the rituals that we, like the washing of the carpets, or sleeping on the roof. She like, we were joking about like her being scared of the cockroaches on the roof and things like that. And I was like, yeah, I remember those. And it's just a different experience when you have someone on your panel who has insight into what you're doing and knows more about the topic than you do. And I definitely would have ended up with a very different thesis if I had access to that at the time.
Yeah, it's weirder because I went the complete opposite direction. I think my entire panel was exclusively white men and white women. And that was like very purposely done, because I was like, okay, like I'm having a lot of difficulty and I'm struggling with this, partially because I don't necessarily have I can't go to like a full Eastern Asian woman, whether they're Chinese, Vietnamese, or that kind of stuff, and then ask them about their experiences, because I exist kind of in between. I'm not, like, my experience isn't equivalent to their experience. And it's been the hardest thing to find other kind of, I would consider, mixed race or biracial authors that go through a similar struggle, even in terms of art. Like, a lot of the art that I ended up finding, it was mostly kind of Eastern Asian diaspora art that I found the most relatable, because I don't relate to kind of the Czech side of my family as much in that way, like visually maybe, if we can make that distinction. And so I think in the end, like, I ended up treating my panel discussion as like who do I think needs to hear this, or hear this struggle, or might not have been confronted with this struggle, right? And I think in the end, all the people like that I brought onto my panel were people that were sympathetic with it and showed empathy. Like, I didn't want to get reamed out for not doing architecture, that kind of stuff. And so I seeked out people that I knew asked critical questions, and then maybe hadn't experienced what I had gone through, just so they could read it, since that was I just wanted to kind of like be like, here's a book I wrote, this is like how conflicting it is to exist in between everything. Enjoy. And
And none of you kind of talked about the experience of fellow students and peers and how they kind of helped or didn't. So I don't know if you want to talk to that. Or
I just want to, just on the last question, I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to, engage staff, professors that did come from a same or similar background from me. And we obviously need more of that at the school and in educational circles, because, I wrote a piece and I didn't have to define those words for them. I just gave them my chapters and they're like, oh yeah, sukkah, I know what that is, or zeta, whatever word it was, they knew what it was. And it just creates like a baseline of understanding. And I feel very fortunate to have had that. And I'm sorry that both of you didn't get to experience that or until the end and had to kind of carve your own path with that. And that's definitely an ongoing conversation, as many of you are aware and involved in. But to speak to fellow students, I mean, I couldn't have done my thesis without some of the people in my studio, in other studios. I mean, something that I brought up earlier is that Panise was thanked in all 3 of our acknowledgements, a huge part of our thesis.
I secretly asked this question for the praise.
I left it to the end. Save the best for last.
Yeah, just, you know.
And just having discussions and having people be open to listening to something that maybe they're not familiar with, or maybe that they don't understand, or coming from it from the other perspective, having people say things that were a little bit like, ooh, I don't know how I feel about that. I'm not quite offended, but it doesn't feel right, like stuff like that. And feeling like, I guess, kind of empowered to have these discussions with people and to bring people up to speed on different cultures or different things that maybe they're not used to. And one of the nights in my sukkah, we had a rabbi in, and that night there was a variety of students from different cultures and backgrounds there who got to ask questions and just talk about their experiences, and that was one of my favorite nights just for this.
Wait, so that wasn't, because I was in that night, that was just that night? I thought the rabbi was, oh, okay, that's cool.
He came the one night, yeah. And
he offered a very interesting perspective into the whole thing, and he was kind of explaining some of the rituals and stuff to us.
Yeah, and
cool.
I think stuff like that should be happening so much more at school. And I mean, to some extent it does, and that's a lot of it is started by the students, the initiatives, and even like having dinners to break fasts, or from a variety of different cultures.
Or iftars.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that that's so important to be sharing with our fellow students.
It kind of makes me wonder like how current master's students are dealing with especially in the beginning of their thesis, because in the beginning you kind of sit through different people's presentations and you kind of compare your work to them, and like it's definitely a tool to help you kind of navigate your own thesis. So I'm always curious like how students are kind of dealing with that right now. Yeah, like for us, like Panise, you were in my studio for the last year, 2002, yeah. And definitely a lot of the conversations
2002, oh, the room, right.
2002,
yeah.
The long room.
Yeah.
You definitely gave me a lot of references as well, like in terms of books and artists, and you were constant, because I had the wall with the references on it, like the artists, and you were always suggesting different people, different authors to me, which was really cool because I wouldn't have known or come across them otherwise. Same with Victor. Victor was also another person who, mainly because we had like a similar schedule, and we were in the studio late at night usually, and bounced ideas off of each other, which was really cool. I kind of feel bad for the current students who are kind of having to, they're missing out on these kind of conversations right now. So I wonder if this kind of format would work for them, like if they kind of designated maybe one night to do like a Zoom call and kind of just discuss things. And
I think they're doing versions of this, but yeah, I was hoping this would become a good platform for them to also speak. Yeah. Jess, do you want to add something, or?
Oh, a cat. So I guess like, so actually like I found the community at Waterloo, I mean, because I've experienced 2 different schools now, like the community is great because I find that there's like so many diverse perspectives that I maybe wasn't, like we didn't talk about these difficult topics. Like we talked about it almost in, like we had a class where some of these topics came up, and then we just kind of realized like who kind of thought racism still didn't exist and which students knew that racism still existed. And then it created like,
wait, this was at Waterloo, or?
So what school Laurentian.
Oh, Laurentian, okay.
And I remember it created this chasm because suddenly we realized like, oh, like that was something that occurred in our second year, and then it created like a kind of a weird feeling about how you discuss these things with people in the space when you kind of know their opinion about certain issues. And so I appreciated how open people were to listening, I think, at Waterloo. And there's like a bunch of people that like in terms of like technical and digital ability. That's something that I kind of really lacked in my own skill set. And people are just like willing to jump right on and like help you figure out Rhino or Grasshopper or 3D printing. Like I didn't know how to 3D print, and then all of my masks at the end were 3D printed just because like Siobhan showed me how to 3D print, and there's like the emblem. You just go on 3D print, and I was like, oh, this is cool. Like this is fun. And it sucks because I know that that's something that people are missing, and people whose species revolved around digital fabrication. It's like a massive hole kind of, I think, in their ability to work through those kinds of things in like a physical way. I think that's one of like, in the end, you can always replicate these kind of social environments. They're maybe not as informal as people would want them to, like when you're in studio, just kind of like shooting the shit and like sharing tidbits or something. But like, yeah, I think one of the things that people are missing the most, I can't like speak exclusively, but I know that like I've talked to a few people, and it's like the people that had something physical that almost gets completely erased in this sort of format. It's very hard to do it in whatever space you're in, or yeah, like it sucks.
Yeah,
It does, yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of, I wanted to close on that, like the idea of doing this kind of personal work, but also this kind of making at this time, between social distancing and this kind of reckoning our society seems to be having with racial questions and its past and present practices. What do you think, and this is the big question that no one can answer, but like how we can think we can bring these ideas into your work in the future, but also your personal life, because I think not all of it can be brought into the practice of architecture, unfortunately. Yeah.
And also right now, since we all made stuff that would require people to kind of show up physically to experience them, like how to move on now with the coronavirus and all of that, and social distancing and everything, which will probably take a while before it gets resolved. For me personally, what I've been working on lately is kind of expanding on my thesis ideas and kind of trying to make them, exploring new ideas that I kind of came up with during my thesis, but doing it digitally now, so that I can somehow maybe upload it on my website or something, and then people can kind of look at them that way. So that's what I've been doing lately, just literally taking the same models that I created before, so I don't have to go to the location physically, and kind of trying to project new things on the rocks and kind of create new objects that are digital. Yeah, and trying to kind of apply for digital competitions and things like that to get the work exposed, because I think it's important. Like I think a lot of us come up with ideas, and then like we kind of tend to put them aside after thesis is done, because it kind of feels like you should do that, but I never want to do that. Like for me, we've talked about this before, it feels like a life's work, and I feel like I just started. So yeah, that's kind of where I am right now in terms of taking it further. I don't want to lose momentum is what I'm trying to say.
Did we lose Danielle?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we did. Oh no. We have Tristan.
We have Tristan.
Tristan, where's Danielle?
Hey, her computer died.
Oh no. Okay.
She's just gonna come over here and take over my computer though.
Okay, sounds good.
Maybe I can speak quickly. So like, there's actually some really really weird and unsettling parallels between a lot of the stuff I made and coronavirus. Just in terms of like, I was like obsessed with masks for like a year and a half.
Oh yeah, right.
At the end of my thesis, masks became a thing, and everyone's like upset about having to cover their face and lose their identity. And it's so funny.
Just use my thesis.
Yeah, like I researched like tons of countries have anti-mask laws that are used to control the public, because anonymity affords you a certain degree of freedom in what you can do, right? And so like masks have a long lineage in riots and protests, where they're used as kind of this subversive device. And so like, I mean, that was one thing that I was like, oh, like as I was writing my thesis, it was right as everything was shutting down. And then I was like, oh no, is this like another chapter I have to build on in my like interiority, exteriority mask chapter? Because this is like, there's so much stuff happening now, and it's like a mask revival. If I can, there's like, and then there's also this kind of weird parallel. So my last prototype was this platform that I made in Bridge, and it was like cloaked in polyethylene sheeting. And I built it, I designed it, built it, and then ran people through it in a span of 3 weeks in January, like of this year. Everything shut down. And like, this is a weird parallel, but it's also 6 feet in diameter, which is the radius So I'm like, like, I'm like connecting the dots, and I sound like a crazy person, but like I feel like on the outside, like in a superficial way, some of the stuff that I've been looking at has now become super potent in a way that, topical in a way that I didn't expect it to. And so once I like amass enough brain power to do something more critical again, like I think I'll pursue a topic that kind of like examines it from that perspective as well.
Yeah, you're still processing what happened. You just defended.
Yeah, like to be honest, rereading my thesis, I was like, oh god, it felt like I use this description all the time where it feels like someone shoots you right in the center of the head with like a water gun, and then the water like doesn't get through. It just like drips down your face slowly, and you're like, no. And, like that's what it felt like to read my own thesis again. So thank you for reading it.
For me, I finished about almost 2 years ago now. So I've been working, and I seeked out a job that would allow me to practice architecture as an intern architect, coming from a place of a similar sensibility that I had explored in my thesis. So kind of this importance of the past, and how we can make sure that I guess the past is appreciated and attention is called to it. So I was working on some adaptive reuse in some heritage buildings, which was has been an amazing experience and very inspiring. A building that probably would have been torn down if not for a really visionary architect and a really adventurous client willing to put in the money to fully revitalize it. Is this old factory building, and it's almost done now, and it's really beautiful and really inspiring to see. So, you know, rather than bringing purely something from my thesis, I think for me, what I learned was to take kind of what's important to me and what I learned from my thesis about, you know, treating the past as something to be built upon and not erased completely, and able to inform the present and to keep it relevant.
Thank you. Does anyone have the dwindling 14 people remaining? Does anyone have questions? They want, yeah, sorry, but this is a really interesting conversation. I don't want to stop it, right? If anyone has any questions to add or any comments or anything. Joanne, you've been studiously making notes, so I'm like wondering if you have anything to say.
Not in particular, just I guess thank you for all of your presentations. Yeah, I really enjoyed this talk too.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, everybody. I think if no one has anything to add, this is the official end of this. Are we?
Oh, when is there going to be another event? Another On Empathy? Maybe talk about that.
It's not yet scheduled,
Okay.
but we will be in communications about it.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Yeah, is there anything anyone wanted to add, like the three presenters, if that we didn't talk about? I mean, there was more questions we had, but I think we covered the gist of a lot of things, and we could keep talking forever. But yeah, if there's anything else in particular that we missed that you want to bring up.
Just that I went back this week and read both Jessica's and Hanine's theses, and I just want to say congratulations to you both, and thank you so much for contributing such great voices to the discussion.
I was actually going to say the exact same thing, is that like I've never read your theses before, both Danielle and Jessica, and I really enjoyed reading them and kind of realizing like why Penny's kind of chose to group us, and Jalia chose to group us all together in this On Empathy talk. And I kind of wish that we had these talks when we were still working on our theses as well. It would have been another one of those kind of studio, you know, conversations that would have been really good to have. But yeah, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Also, like, thanks everyone for dropping in and for staying this long. I also kind of want to say thanks Danielle and Hanine, because I totally read both of your theses as I was working on my own. And Panine, you totally helped me navigate like how much theory would I have to include for Derek to be satisfied, I guess. Like what levels.
And mind you, Derek wasn't even my supervisor. He was just my committee member, but like, yeah.
Yeah, but I kind of just went all in on the theory anyways, so it helped. But it was like great to just see how you guys each confronted it. And I think like I really appreciate how you guys approached the theses, because it's kind of like as I mentioned before, like there's a certain bravery with telling a story that's very personal. And I told it, I guess I told my thesis in my own way, but I always felt like it wasn't like it could be more personal. And both of you, I think, took it on like as a full on like this is a personal thesis and I'm running with it kind of thing. So it was really great to read.
Definitely made us feel very vulnerable. Like I struggled with that a lot. I know reading Danielle's thesis, she had like a crying session at one point in the beginning of her thesis. Yep. Is Danielle still here? Do we still
yeah. She's under Tristan.
Oh, there she is. Okay. Yeah, Danielle, reading that, I related so much to that. Like, I know you mentioned that in the beginning of your thesis, and I was like, I've had moments like that where I was like debating whether I should even do a personal thesis about my own identity, because it like definitely brings forth a lot of the pain that I felt having my identity and feeling kind of like I don't belong, you know, in the Middle East or in Canada, you know. So it's nice to see that somebody else has also done that. So yeah, thanks for sharing your stories.
Vanta, were you raising your hand or were you just playing with your, okay. Cool. I think with that, we will conclude this session of On Empathy officially. And thank you all for being here. It was a delightful conversation. We'll be posting this somewhere somehow. We're at both, Jolly and I were recording it, so hopefully between the two of us, we have a good recording of it. And hopefully more people get to see it, because I think it was a very informative conversation, especially for people who are working on their theses or people who are thinking about going into masters. And even if you're an undergrad, I think the beginnings of ideas to explore identity and topics that are not being said in school happen in undergrad, right? You kind of get glimpses of it in studio projects and ICO papers and here and there. And in masters, you finally can run free with it. So yeah, I think it would be a very beneficial conversation for more people to witness. And thank you all for the time. And yeah, have a good night. And there are, I guess I will save the chat too, because I think fun things have been.
Oh yeah, we didn't even look at the.
Yeah, no, I've been looking.
Send it to us.
I've been looking at it as like commentary. There, a lot of people kind of ended up saying, "Thank you, I have to leave." So,
oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll just save it and give it to everybody later, I guess. Yeah.
Awesome. Great.
Well, it was nice to see everybody.
Yeah.
It was nice to see you too, Tammy. Thanks for coming.
It was so nice to see you guys. I'm so proud of you all so much.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you, Tammy, for bringing us humans together. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jolly and Panise. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. You did a great job, all of you. Panise, you're a great MC. You're natural.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.